welcome, and I'm very glad to be back with you because 1 minute ago I lost my screen entirely, but here I am, and these are the vagaries of community organized events. As a special welcome to our three candidates, I should note that we did invite candidates from all parties, but tonight we will not have the Conservative candidate present. So present we have Carolyn Bennett from the Liberals, Sidney Coles from the New Democratic Party, Phil De Silva of the Green Party. And may I begin by asking each of our panelists, starting with Carolyn Bennett, to introduce yourself in less than 1 minute, perhaps mentioning any special interest you have in climate or ecology. So let's begin with Carolyn.
Apologies, Richard, just really quickly, a quick correction. My last name is DeLuna, not De Silva.
Oh, I'm very sorry.
That's okay.
Carolyn?
Sure. Firstly, I'd like to thank Lynn for the beautiful land acknowledgement, which we all acknowledge, and to just say I'm reapplying for this job that I love, and the environment's been a priority for decades. As a physician, it was started with smog days 20 years ago, being horrified in Tuktoyaktuk, looking at the community freezer, the water trickling down the walls of the ice walls. It was very clear that we had to fight for the ratification of Kyoto, and I was appalled when Canada pulled out in 2011. So I've known a lot of you for a long time because we're in this together. Canada is a big, cold country. We travel big distances and have to heat our homes in the winter, and we have to be intentional and effective in weaning ourselves off fossil fuels. Ideas and targets won't work without a serious plan. So Canada is now rising to these challenges, for which we are all impatient. I often think, Richard, that if only we'd listened to the First Peoples to think 7 generations out, we wouldn't be in this crisis today, and we need to listen to them now. We cannot go backwards. We need a credible and sincere plan that includes all Canadians, and the Liberal plan will get us to net zero.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Let's move on now to Sidney.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank the organizers for putting on this event. I think that what you've said is absolutely true. I think that that climate and the climate emergency is the foregrounding issue of our time. And I recognize that we all have a really important piece to play in that, in quite frankly, the history of our country. I've been working with women around the globe for quite some time now. I am a gender equity specialist, and I have worked in Ethiopia, I've worked in Benin, I've worked in the Republic of Congo, looking at how the extraction industry impacts women there. I also recently did an evaluation for the Global Green Grants Fund for women's empowerment programs across sub-Saharan Africa. And what I can tell you is that women are at the forefront of the fight against, climate change. They are our land and water protectors and advocates. And I've been just so proud to be involved in supporting those grassroots movements around the world.
Thank you, Sidney. Finally, Phil.
Thank you so much. Again, I want to thank the organizers and the other panelists for being here today, the candidates. I'm a clean tech scientist. I founded a clean tech company, and I worked at the National Research Council as a director, where I led a $57 million clean tech program, trying to help discover technologies to decarbonize Canada. I know exactly what it takes to go from discovery in the lab into the marketplace. And I came to the realization that while science and technology is necessary and important, it's not sufficient to make change. We have the technology we need. What we lack is political will. What we lack is action. And so that's why I'm running for office. I'm running because we only have one Earth, we only have one world, and we need to leave it in a sustainable way. And we have to do so while making sure that the people who most impacted by this will have a clean and green energy destination to transition to. So thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you very much. And before we move on to the questioning, may I take about 2 minutes just to emphasize the importance of this election. So the latest UN climate report issued in June was summarized by the Secretary General of the United Nations as a code red for humanity. On the climate front, it's a matter of now or never. We've entered a decisive decade for humanity and the other species. And this report is hard to dismiss as overwrought, as it was written by 234 usually very cautious climate scientists and draws on thousands of scientific studies and 5 earlier reports. Now, the optimal goal is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial levels. That degree of warming would allow a disrupted but livable future for most, though not all of us. We are already suffering today from extreme weather events with only 1.1 degrees of warming, so the crisis has arrived. Yet the UN climate report, which I just mentioned, forecasts a lower than 50% possibility that we will succeed in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, even in its most optimistic scenario. We could still achieve 1.5 degree goal, but it would require reducing global emissions by 7 to 8% each year over the next 10 years. And this at a time when global emissions are still growing. This is a challenge unlike any other we have encountered. We have a better chance of limiting global warming to 2 degrees by 2100, though even that will be very difficult. But there is a world of difference between 1.5 degree increase and 2.0 degree increase in world temperatures, according to the 218 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. At 2 degrees, we risk triggering various climate tipping points with unpredictable but dire consequences. Therefore, we must try for a 1.5 degree goal. In short, we face an emergency. The carbon concentration in the atmosphere today is higher than it's been in 2 million years. Yet global emissions continue to grow. Canada's emissions have fallen modestly since 2005, but Canadians still produce more greenhouse gas emissions per person than any other member of the G20. Given this dire context, we need leaders who can take hard decisions and rally support for the sacrifices and disruptions that lie just ahead. That is why we organized this debate tonight. Just a word to begin before we go into the questions about the rules of the debate. After I pose each question, each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond. And as you know, Daniel will warn you at the 30 seconds before the 2 minutes is up. After all candidates have addressed each question, the panelists will then have 3 minutes to query positions of others. Please note the audience expects a respectful exchange and no interruptions. So panelists will be asked in this 3-minute segment to raise their hands if they wish to query another candidate, and no query or answer should take more than 30 seconds. We all need to remember that no party represented here is a climate denialist. Candidates differ over means to achieve the same goal. Let's hear only about policies and timelines. Okay, now moving now to the first question, which is on the green recovery. And I'd like Carolyn to be the first speaker, followed by Sidney and then Phil. Here's the question. This pandemic has devastated communities across the country. While we rebuild our economy and secure citizens' livelihoods, we have an opportunity to change direction by forging a low-carbon society, retrofitting mass transit, electric vehicles, replacing carbon-intensive cement production, reforestation, and regenerative agriculture are just some major ways to reduce our net carbon emissions. The question is, what specific actions will your party take in this emergency situation to work toward an environmentally sustainable, low-carbon economic recovery? And when do you see such measures being implemented? I'd also add, that a member of the audience has asked a question on retrofitting. So it's not necessary for you now to answer that part of the question, as we'll come to it in the second part of the program. So Carolyn, could you begin the answers?
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you for your ongoing leadership. This is, it is the existential threat to our country and to the planet, and I think it is well recognized that putting a price on carbon is key, and that I think that has been a very important initiative of our government, and that we're intentional about raising that to $170 per ton by 2030, and that we know that will make a difference. I know that even in terms of the retrofits for homes, but also to have a net zero emissions building strategy, I think that we have, you know, as Phil would know, that the $3 billion that we've invested in clean technology, we've just got to continue on that, but also by making the green choices the easy choices. And that means how do we have people be able to afford a zero emission vehicle, and how do we make sure that that half of the cars sold or vehicles sold in Canada would be zero emission by 2030, and all of them by 2035. I think the $12 billion invested in public transportation, the GTHA has been unprecedented with the electric buses and cars, but also the other investments in cycle paths and walkways, and of course my favorite, the ravine strategy, which may at least be the Toronto Ravine Strategy, which although it's about having Canadians understand the importance of nature and being able to get outside and all be part of these solutions. So I'm very proud of the record that we have to date, but we are all impatient, and we want to just make sure that we can do even better.
Thank you very much. We move on now to Sidney.
Hi, everyone. I think we can all agree, all of us, the three of us at least that are here, that, you know, net zero is our mutual ultimate climate goal. I am going to argue that the Liberals can't really naturally deliver while they're still tied to fossil fuels as they are, and remain bailing out the big banks who also finance fossil fuels. I mean, carbon taxes are helpful, but they're not going to get us out of what is actually a deepening emergency. So since and I just wanted to point out that since the 2015 Paris Agreement, Canada's 5 largest banks have continued to pour billions of dollars into fossil fuels. Jagmeet Singh has been talking for a long time about bold and just climate action, and sort of integrating that with a more caring society that leaves no one behind. And I think what I value about our approach, the NDP approach, is that we are going to utilize the skills of Canadian workers and newcomers to Canada, who will play an enormous role in building the Canada that we want and moving forward in this pandemic, through, you know, retraining, transitioning workers into new jobs, and allowing workers to learn the new skills that will take us into a better and more secure future that promises a change and a course of action change that will improve our collective well-being, not only just as human beings, and I think, you know, we are sort of focusing on human beings, but also the well-being of relations in the animal and plant world as well. The NDP has promised to double the Canadian Community Fund, the Community Building Fund, which will provide communities with $4.4 billion a year to invest in green priorities like public transit projects that will help municipalities across the country electrify all of their fleets by 2030. And I think, you know, we are looking at what I would consider a really lovely sort of mix of, as I said, bold climate action in integrating a sort of a transition, a worker transition, in combination with also a focus on a caring society that will not only not leave people behind, but will integrate those factors that make well-being a focal point of recovery.
Thank you. And finally, we go to Phil on this question.
Thank you so much. So you asked for specific measures and specific timelines. It's simple. The Green Party is committed to 60% emission reductions by 2030, starting with enforceable targets and timelines in 2023. This will put us on track to be net zero by 2050. And in fact, the Green Party and the climate plan that the Green Party has put forward is the only plan of any of the parties that gives us a fighting chance at getting to 1.5 degrees Celsius or below of the IPCC report. There's 5 simple steps to this. Step 1 is we have to protect what we have. We need to increase environmental protections, especially on the land sinks and the carbon sinks that we do have. We need to stop tearing down old growth. For example, the BC NDP government has not stood against the Fairy Creek lodging as an example. Step 2, we need to increase renewables everywhere. The Green Party is committed to a 100% renewable electricity grid by 2030. Once we have these clean electrons, then we can move to step 3, which is electrify everything. We have to electrify our transportation sector, our building sector with electric vehicles and heat pumps and building retrofits, and tackle as much of our transportation and building sector as much as possible. Step 4 is to tackle the hard to abate sectors, the sectors which are difficult or impossible to electrify, like agriculture and steel making. And fossil fuel production, we absolutely need to stop, which is exactly why the Greens have committed to ending 100% phase out of fossil fuels by 2035. And it begins with canceling the Trans Mountain Pipeline, because let's face it, this is $12 billion of taxpayer money that is locking us into 5 decades worth of CO2 emissions as a sunk cost. Because that's how these projects remain profitable, is through long amortization periods. And then finally, step 5, we have to capture carbon from the atmosphere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now we have the opportunity for panelists to query each other for up to 3 minutes for this, and no one speaking for more than 30 seconds. Would anyone like to pose a query? Yes, Carolyn. I'm sorry, may I say, I don't see all 3 faces of the candidates on my screen, unfortunately, but Carolyn had her hand up, so please go first.
Thank you very much. I think what we're saying is that this needs to be accountable. We put in legislation for climate accountability and net zero with a panel that will get us there. But I think both the other candidates have to acknowledge that both Andrew Weaver, the former head of the BC Green Party, has said we had the most credible plan, and Mark Jacquard, professor of sustainable energy at SFU, has said that ours is a serious plan and sincere, and rated the Liberal plan best with 8 out of 10 for Liberals and 4 out of 10 for the Greens and 2 out of 10 for the NDP.
Yes, anybody else like to respond or to ask a question?
I'd just like to jump in on those comments around Andrew Weaver and Mark Jacquard. We have to remember that that scorecard that was produced by Mark Jacquard, an economist, was done purely on the basis of the carbon taxing. And it was also done before the Green Party released its platform, which, and I'll give credit where credit is due, credit to the Liberals for being able to bring the carbon tax to the forefront. That is an amazing thing that the Green Party wants to accelerate, because we have to continue to price our carbon, and we have to remember what this costs not only ourselves today, but future generations. If we don't appropriately price our carbon, we won't get there. So I do want to say that description of the plans for both the NDP and the Greens, well, at least for the Greens, was incomplete at the time, and also only looked at economic measures, not at mandates, not at research or innovation policy, just economic measures.
Thank you, Phil.
I'd like
Sidney?
to jump in here just to say, you know, I understand that we've had the endorsement on the Liberal Action Plan, but I would also say that David Miller came out endorsing the NDP plan, saying that was the most practical and the most even-keeled and even-minded platform of all of the parties, actually, that just came out recently. So I guess we're going to decide if this is a, you know, if we're watching a movie, if this is, you know, Rogers or Egbert giving us the thumbs up or thumbs down, depending on which camp you're in. So I think, you know, I think we can look at outside endorsements as interesting, but and I would also add that many of the members and former members of the Green Party just endorsed Avi Lewis, who is our federal NDP candidate out west, and has said that, you know, with climate activists like him, the NDP can't go wrong.
Thank you, Sidney. The next question actually overlaps with the first, so I think we should move on to that one to continue this discussion. The next question relates to energy transition. I'd like to begin the questioning with Phil, moving to Sidney, and then Carolyn. In 2018, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said we must cut emissions by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050 to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The International Energy Agency has recently stated that the pathway to net zero emissions is narrow but still achievable. If we want to reach net zero by 2050, we do not need any more investments in new oil, gas, and coal projects. Achieving a livable future requires massive deployment of all clean energy technologies in the next decade. So the question is, what specific actions will your party take to promote renewable energy in Canada? Will you stop all fossil fuel subsidies? And when will these specific actions be implemented? So let's begin the answers with Phil.
Thank you for the question. I'm going to answer this by sharing a bit of a personal story about why energy transition is personal for me and why it's so important. I immigrated to Canada when I was 5 years old to Windsor, Ontario, which was once the automotive capital of Canada. My dad, who was an engineer in the Philippines, his credentials weren't recognized here, and he was an auto worker. He worked at the Ford plant until it closed down in 2008. That was when the fall of the automotive sector happened. And I know firsthand what it's like to live in a community that is dependent on one industry and what happens when that industry fades away. My dad has been jumping around from factory job to factory job since. That exact same thing is happening in today's oil and gas industry and heavy emissions industry, and that will only continue to increase if we have any chance of reaching our 1.5 degree goals. And so the energy transition to me isn't just about, of course, saving the planet, but it's also about ensuring that families and workers and communities are not left behind. And this is exactly why we have to invest now and why the Greens are committed to a just recovery and a just transition, ensuring that every single oil and gas job would be replaced by a high-paying green job. And we have to remember that oil and gas is a cyclical industry. It's boom and bust. It's not consistent. These aren't good jobs. They're hard jobs. They're jobs that aren't very safe. But green jobs are consistent. They're the future. This is the economy of the 21st century. So how will the Greens get us there? We will invest in retraining programs, in wage insurance, and early retirement plans to ensure that there is no family left behind. Will we stop all fossil fuel subsidies? Absolutely, immediately. And that's how we're going to pay for these retraining programs. If we are able to take, the $12 billion to build a pipeline and instead put that towards investing in clean technologies, imagine how far closer we could be towards reaching our goals. When will these specific actions be implemented? As soon as possible. As I said before, we would phase out all oil and gas production by 2035 and immediately ban any exploration today.
Thank you. Let's move on then to Sidney.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question. It's a really important question. As a candidate, I know I, along with my Green colleague Phil, actually signed the 350.org petition and committed to ending fossil fuel subsidies. And yesterday, I also pledged my support as a candidate to endorse Team Climate 2021's Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. I'm also getting a message that my internet's unstable. So if it continues to be that way, I'll just take my video off. So just let me know, okay? Now I've lost my train of thought, which is really terrible in the middle of a 1 minute and 30-second countdown.
The treaty, you were talking about the treaty that you signed.
Right. One thing that I will say is that the NDP is not unlike our Green colleague, is focused on a just transition where no worker is going to be left behind. The transition is going to take time. Even the proliferation agreement does indicate that there are 3 stages to this thing. There is, non-proliferation. Then there is you stop investing in fossil fuels. And then there is engagement in new technologies. These things take time. And, Phil, as a scientist himself, knows that the time that it takes between R&D, actual rollout, and scale up takes time. And it's not because I want to take the incremental approach that says, this is not urgent. But what I will say is that we need a lot of re-education to do. We also need to re-educate consumers. this is a time we need to change patterns of consumption in our country and decide that we need to actually move forward in a society that looks at consuming, travel, all kinds of things quite rather differently, and then works with green technology sectors in alignment with what needs to be also, in my respect, some education and behavioral, I wouldn't call it modification, but changes in how we view our own ideas of wealth, consumption, and where in terms of our society we are heading with respect to inclusion and justice. And I also want to make a point of also including the fact that we have to be very mindful that we are not entering into technologies and perspectives that are not inclusive in terms of racial inequity and gender equity. Oh, that was my time out. So there, I just gave up some time wondering about if I was going to disappear, but I'm still here.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to move to Carolyn.
Yes, thanks so much. And I thank you both for the passion and commitment, because this is really the way out of this, as Phil has worked through his life, and also Minister Wilkinson in terms of his 20 years in clean tech, that this is really, really important. We have, because of our commitment, we will end the fossil fuel subsidies by 2023. There's no question that during the pandemic that some of the commitments to the orphan wells was provided jobs for people in the patch. That's also good for the environment as we get rid of those orphan wells and their emissions. So it is, I think that we will plan the phase out of public financing of the sector, a clean electricity standard that will cut emissions by 2030 to 100% net zero emitting electricity by 2035. And I think one of the exciting things is wanting Canada to be a leader because of lithium and batteries and be able to power this clean economy. So it is, as we've said, $3 billion already in investing in clean techs, but it is about how we help heavy industries decarbonize and succeed in the clean economy with the Net Zero Accelerator Fund, cut taxes in half for businesses that manufacture zero emission products, and that we are helping in terms of Canadians improving the efficiency of their homes. So it is about the electrification of the vehicles and to build a net zero electricity grid by 2035. So it is about us having a comprehensive plan that will allow all Canadians to be part of it, but actually intentional about getting us off fossil fuels.
Thank you. Well, since I can't see all three candidates, I won't ask anyone to put their hand up, but I will simply follow the order of answering. To ask if, first of all, Phil, do you have any query you would like to raise with either of the other candidates?
Yes, to Minister Bennett, my question is, if you've had these amazing plans for climate change, how come emissions continue to increase year on year over the past 6 years? We keep hearing about plans, but why are our emissions still increasing? And then to Ms. Coles, my question to you is, will you commit to ending the Trans Mountain Pipeline?
Okay, let's move to Sidney. She can to answer that or to ask another question. Sidney?
So from Phil, the question to end the Trans Mountain Pipeline, I think what Jagmeet has said repeatedly is that he does not agree with the any additional infrastructure on the TMX. I think that in honesty, I think the Liberals and the Conservative governments have left the NDP and the Green Party, quite frankly, ending up having to clean up messes left, right, and center that were left by agreements and contracts that were signed prior to this year and prior to years ago. And I think the problem for both the NDP and the Greens is that what to do with contracts that have been signed, commitments and dollar commitments that have been made, and getting out of complex contracts that I didn't sign, nor did your party sign, but that the Liberals and the Conservatives over time have gotten us into. And I think that both of our parties are spending a lot of time and energy trying to figure out how to clean up the Liberal and Conservative messes that they've left us.
Okay, thank you. Now we move to Carolyn for her comment or query.
I think that, Phil, thank you for the question. This is a complex issue where we need provinces and territories to be partners with us on this. This has not been easy, but I really do believe we are the people who have the plan to get us to net zero by 2050, and with the accountability framework to make sure that happens. This is a comprehensive plan, and even I still think that from Andrew Weaver and the people that have looked at the complexity of this issue, that we're very, very pleased that he has said that we have the only credible plan to take us through this.
Thank you. Let's move on now to the third issue, which involves Indigenous rights. And I'd appreciate it if Sidney would be the first to answer, followed by Carolyn and then Phil. Indigenous people play a critical role in environmental solutions. How will you invest in Indigenous-led land use planning and the establishment of Indigenous protected and conserved areas, ultimately bringing us closer to realizing in practice the Truth and Reconciliation Act? Let's begin with Sidney.
Thank you. That's a really important question. It is probably one of the other important questions of our time, because I do believe, and the NDP does believe, that it is going to be Indigenous leadership and nation-to-nation engagement that is going to inform our best practices moving forward. I would argue that Indigenous people have always been and will continue to be our most integral, and I mean that from the sense, the root word of integrity, defenders of the land and water. And I think when we are actually following their lead, and not by consultation, but by consent in many respects, that we will get it right. I think, Jagmeet Singh has repeatedly referred to the land back movement, the idea of conservation. I think we have a lot of sort of buzzwords that go around conserving things, the environment through the protection of national parks, for example. But, we have the Indigenous argument that those national parks were theirs to begin with, and that it's not necessarily about preserving pieces or parts or little corners of our beautiful country, but rather protecting the whole of Turtle Island as it is under the leadership of Indigenous leaders. And I think it's more than time that we keep talking about inviting them to the table. Well, I actually wonder whose table are we being invited to? In other words, I think those tables have turned. We need to be invited to their table, because we really do need Indigenous leadership on this action moving forward.
Thank you. Carolyn the second.
Thank you. I love this question, of course, because it is about the land, and it is about us moving forward on where the land claims have been settled, that we are doing really well. And so Nunangat and the Inuit are at every table around land use planning, and is a brilliantly successful model for what we have to have going forward. Up at the High Arctic Research Station, it is now that Inuit and Indigenous knowledge keepers are an integral part of that team, and I think that we helped establish the first Indigenous protected and conserved area, and now substantial new investments for that program. We're working with the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis partners to expand the new Indigenous Guardians Network. I think that we already have examples, Sidney, with the co-management of the parks, a very successful Haida Gwaii, managing the park at Gwaii-Hanas, South Island. This is an exciting way, and I think we can do more. With Bill C-69, it became very important that Indigenous people would be at the first idea of a project, that they have to be there at the table when even an idea of a project is being thought about. And I think that this is a matter of the changes we've made. Can they be part of the project? Do they not think the project's a good idea? And so our approach has been changing from adversary, like the previous government, to a true partner in their care. And I am worried that the criticisms that nothing has changed would allow a conservative government to roll back everything we've achieved in closing gaps and righting wrongs and accelerating the path to self-determination and getting that land back, as we've had with many examples with the Department of National Defense. But we know we've got to do more. Land is the most important thing.
Thank you very much. Then finally, Phil.
Thank you for the question. And of course, this is an incredibly important question. And I want to thank both Carolyn and Sidney for both of their answers. I will be the first to admit that I'm not an expert on Indigenous relations or on Indigenous peoples. I'll be the first to admit humbly that I have so much more to learn and so much more to do. But I also say that whatever decisions that we make has to come from the place of nation to nation, and recognizing that Indigenous nations are not a monolith, and that every single community, every single Indigenous nation has the right and has the expectation of equal treatment and respect and collaboration. I'll give an example of ways that currently Indigenous peoples are limited in their ability to care for and use and properly have ownership and stewardship over the land. One example is in terms of farming. Under the Indian Act, Indigenous people cannot leverage land in order to get loans to purchase farming equipment so that they can begin to farm. Another example is by making without proper ability and resourcing to Indigenous peoples, but also putting upon them the burden of every single project having a specific review. Many Indigenous communities are overwhelmed by these questions from oil and gas companies and mining companies and all of these sorts of things. We have to not pass the buck over to them, but rather we should just stop the exploitation of the lands completely. We should stop using and completely stop fossil fuel extraction and production. So again, the question was, how will we invest in Indigenous-led land use planning and establishment of Indigenous protected and conserved areas? In the Green platform, it specifically says we will promote and support establishment of Indigenous protected and conserved areas.
Thank you very much. So now we enter the segment in which the panelists can query comments by the other panelists. And let us begin by asking Sidney whether she has any comment.
I do have a comment. I think Phil is not wrong when he does say that we ask. It almost to me is analogous to the whole idea of that a person need to prove their innocence in a court of law. And what we ask often Indigenous people to do is to put the resources that are often asymmetrical into the opposition of and in the consultation process against a machinery and a bulwark of legal, which is often feels like to them a legal obstructionism that they have to wade through, that is so extraordinarily asymmetrical in terms of resources that I think they often feel like they are coming out fighting Goliath every time. And I think Phil is not wrong in that. I would like to just say that I find it, I'm sorry, but a bit rich that the Liberal minister would say that she is a partner in care of Indigenous communities, given the press that she's had around her dealings with, you know, taking Indigenous children and survivors of residential schools to court. So I have a real tough time sort of putting those two things on the same ledger. Someone who's interested in caring and also using those two words, partnership and care, don't jive with me, but that's not really having to do with the climate issue. I think the other thing too is that the way that these legal engagements work and these consultative processes work is that we do put in an unbearable onus on Indigenous communities from a legal perspective and a resource perspective to once again sort of fight policies that are based on constitutional and other legalities that are so asymmetrical that they remain unfair.
Thank you. Carolyn, do you have a comment to make?
Well, maybe I would just respond in terms of the example of the Inuit and the land claims organizations in the Nunangat, that when they object to a project, it doesn't happen. And so, like Baffin land expansion, that there are tremendous examples that if Indigenous people are at the table, they get to choose green light a project that they agree with, amber light and make better a project they're a little, and red light, or warn people that this project just isn't a good idea, and work with whatever the promoter is. So we can do this by having them at the table as a partner, and I do feel that in all of the work that we've been doing, we have moved the needle from adversary to partner in everything we've done.
Thank you. Hey, Phil, you might have a comment.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to bring this back to Indigenous, and the intersection between Indigenous relations and climate change. And I think one thing that I'd like to bring to the table is the opportunity for clean technology to drastically improve Indigenous communities. And the example that I give is how many remote communities currently run off of diesel. There is a wonderful nonprofit organization called Iron and Earth, founded by oil and gas workers who recognize that they needed to transition. What they do is they provide training to other oil and gas workers and Indigenous communities on how to build microgrids, how to build sustainable solar farms, and these sorts of things. So again, when we talk about Indigenous rights, truth, reconciliation, and climate change, we have to recognize that Indigenous knowledge is extremely important, and they are at the front lines of the climate crisis, but also that we can work together, and clean technology could be an opportunity to help improve outcomes, especially in remote Indigenous communities.
Thanks, Phil. And now we move on to the fourth question, which relates to adaptation. And in this case, I'd like Carolyn to begin providing an answer, followed by Phil and then Sidney. British Columbia recently experienced the hottest heat wave ever recorded in Canada. In a single week, 570 people died suddenly as a result of the extreme heat. Climate scientists anticipate more frequent and more intense heat waves in the coming years. In the Toronto-St. Paul's riding, tenants may be particularly vulnerable to extreme temperatures due to the urban heat island effect, where heat is trapped by surrounding buildings and paved surfaces. What will you do to help our community adapt to this and other climate-related impacts that are affecting us now and in the near future? Carolyn, would you like to begin answering that question?
Absolutely. This is such an important question, as we've seen all summer, that from the fires to the floods to the extreme weather, that this is, there's no question that this is increasing in frequency and severity due to human activity. And so the crucial part of the answer is to push ahead with the determined efforts to address climate change directly. But there's no question that we will need an adaptation strategy. And so we are finalizing Canada's first ever national adaptation strategy by 2022, which includes the CMHC deep home retrofits, the low cost flood protection insurance, the flood maps, and dedicating $500 million to developing the firefighting capacities in obviously in the Indigenous communities who know exactly what needs to happen, but they also are asking to have a say in the forestry practices so that some of this can be protected and that we don't have to have the same kind of devastation. So I think it's hugely important going forward. And just in terms of, Richard, I just think that there's a difference between the UN Declaration Act and the TRC calls to action, and that I think there's been a bit of a confusion in what Sidney's put up on Twitter. And so it really is, we are 80% the way through on the TRC calls to action of things that are federal or shared, and that we will continue to do more. But listening to Indigenous partners is going to be a lot of the adaptation. And we also, in terms of the previous question, it's the First Nations that have the big solar farms and wind farms, and they are so good at wanting to be part of the solutions.
Thank you very much. So now we move on to Phil.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, urban heat islands are a massive problem, and they're only continuing to get worse, especially as climate change worsens. Again, the main reason for this is radiation and sunlight gets trapped and reflected upon building surfaces, etc. The number one thing that we can do to protect our cities is to increase green space. The number one thing that we can do is to ensure, and this is what the Greens have done, that municipalities are properly funded, and true to the grassroots nature of the Green Party, local action is effective action. So municipalities only receive about 10% of taxes that are collected within their jurisdictions. The Green Party would increase that share. We would do it to fund greater community involvement and greater protection of green spaces, more public parks, increase the opportunity to decarbonize through retrofits, increase public transit, electrify the public transit, and of course, all of this is part and parcel of the adaptation strategy. In addition to making sure that the temperature is lowered by having canopy cover and green space, we would also propose an adaptation fund to make sure and understand that natural disasters will continue to occur. So we have to be ready and we have to be prepared. We can't be caught flat-footed again, just like we were with the pandemic. Similar to the pandemic, climate change also has lagging indicators. Instead of deaths being the indicator for infection, global warming is the indicator for emissions. So we have an opportunity now to be prepared. If we make the same mistakes and don't invest in what was then, for example, our pharmaceutical industry and the ability for us to produce vaccines, then we will be again caught flat-footed when we have to invest in adaptation strategies, when inevitably sea levels will rise, droughts will occur, and forest fires will continue to occur. So I know the question was specifically about Toronto St. Paul's. Again, I would advocate for increasing protections to our ravine systems, increasing our green space, etc. But we have to remember adaptation is really important nationwide too.
Thanks very much. Now we go finally to Sidney on this question.
Yes, thank you again for the question. I mean, it hits home very personally for me. My daughter is a paramedic and has been working in BC, and during that heat wave, luckily she wasn't actually on her shift when that happened, but how many of her colleagues were subject to the traumatic and traumatizing impact of having to go around helping people, or just, you know, having to collect folks who didn't survive that heat wave. So very personal in our house. What I would do in terms of with respect to Toronto St. Paul's, the luck of my draw is that I actually have a friend and colleague in MPP Jill Andrew, who is from the same party as I am. So the two of us will work in combination to make sure that the people in our riding are housed in safe, well-built, well-maintained and accessible housing, and that they, you know, that will allow them to, I guess, quote unquote, weather these intense storms like we had the other night. That was very, very scary. I'm sure multiple people experienced some flooding during that time. We would ensure that developers are including green rooftops and green spaces. I agree with Phil on that in their designs for projects here in Toronto St. Paul's. I know that there are at least 8 large condo development projects to set out to roll out across Eglinton Avenue West. And these projects have to include green spaces as well as units that have energy efficient appliances and fixtures that reduce electricity and water consumption. So we're going to work with our union colleagues in trades and steel and make sure that these units get built in the most efficient and in the most efficient ways possible. The other thing is schools and retirement facilities in Toronto St. Paul's need to be outfitted with air conditioners, and we need also cooling stations for folks who are unhoused. And then I wanted to point out that there is a huge discrepancy in green space accessibility in parts of Toronto, St. Paul's, where part of the riding gets a lot of access to ravines, trees, parks, but in other parts of the riding, there are no such access to ravines and parks. So I would really like to work with my fabulous MPP to make sure that we are working with the municipalities to provide more green spaces for those areas of their constituents, of the constituency that just does not have enough green canopy and respite from the heat.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, the fifth and final area for questioning is climate leadership and public engagement. Given the fact that we're falling a bit behind in time, there were two parts to this question, but I will only pose the first part in order to try and keep to our schedule. So Toronto City Council has recently adopted a treaty for the non-proliferation of fossil fuels. This treaty is a global initiative to end dependence on fossil fuels, starting with no new fossil fuel infrastructure approvals. So the question is, will you endorse the City Council's request that the Prime Minister of Canada direct government officials to negotiate such a global treaty at the International Climate Meeting in Glasgow in November? Will your government help build international momentum for phasing out fossil fuels? And let's begin the questioning with Sidney, followed by Phil and Carolyn.
I think I just initially did say that I did sign on to the non-proliferation agreement, as well as the 350.org commitment, as did my colleague Phil DeLuna. I'm not sure that Carolyn Bennett was able to sign on as we did, but I do really feel, and I'm insisting on this, that we need to regain the respect of the international community when it comes to Canadian climate action efforts. Greta Thunberg had some scathing words recently at the Austrian World Summit, and she, in my mind, was really pointedly speaking to Prime Minister Trudeau when she spoke about her frustration with play acting, theatrics, and this pretense to wage war on the emergency while, on the other hand, buying pipelines. I think, we have not reached our climate targets since the Paris Agreement. It's an embarrassment because we are continually putting on what she called beautiful but empty words. I think young people are sort of have lost their faith in the Liberal government and in Trudeau. And again, Greta Thunberg said it so lovely. Well, it's scathingly, but it's not lovely. But oddly enough, scathing words can sound quite eloquent when she said that nature and physics are not entertained by your theater anymore. And I think she was pointedly directing that at Justin Trudeau, who, as we know, comes out of his drama background and School of Acting, and he's a very good actor. But the show is over. I think we need to get back and if we're going to commit to these non-proliferation agreements, hold the line, stay steady, and have a voice of authority that we can take out there on the world stage, because we don't have one right now. I think people have lost trust in the Canadian government to do what it said it would do. And I think Jagmeet will move us through the course in a just transition, and will absolutely make good on the promises that he has made. And sometimes they can feel a little bit too sort of step by step, a little bit too sort of maybe not as bold as some would like. But what I will say about Jagmeet is that he makes promises that he can keep. While they feel incremental, it's because he's not willing to make promises as Trudeau that he can't keep.
Thank you very much, Sidney. Let's go now to Phil.
Great, thank you. Yes, I've said it before, 100%, the Green Party would 100% be in favor of the treaty for non-proliferation of fossil fuels. We have said we want to completely eliminate the exploitation and use of fossil fuels by 2035 as soon as possible. At COP26, this is a moment, an inflection point. This is code red for humanity. We've heard this over and over and over again. We need international cooperation and collaboration to actually have any chance of reducing worldwide emissions. And I want to talk a little bit about Canada's role in this. Canada, as was mentioned before, is one of the top 3 emitters per capita in the world. We have a responsibility to help develop the technologies and the solutions that developing countries can then use. We have the responsibility to bear the first cost of that, because over time, if we think about the wealth that this country has generated on the backs of fossil fuels over the Industrial Revolution, we have to think about not only the yearly emissions, but the emissions that have already been done. And Canada has more than enough of its fair share of emissions that have been done. Who are we to tell the developing world, you know what, we have our quality of life, we're good, but you can't increase your quality of life with more energy production. So it is incumbent upon us to help them leapfrog fossil fuels and move to a point where we can have a sustainable and renewable future where they don't need to exploit fossil fuels to have an increased quality of life. So how will our government help build momentum internationally to do this? Well, the Green Party is a global party. There are other Green parties in other countries around the world. And I'll give the example of the Green Party in Germany, which is poised to form government. So the Green Party is a party that isn't just confined to one nation, but rather is international in scope, and it is aligned along one purpose: to ensure that we have a planet to live on. So how will we build that momentum? By working with other Green parties and other parties around the world, and the youth who have taken to the streets to demand for action.
Thank you, Phil. Finally, we have Carolyn.
Thanks very much. This question reminded me of a conversation with one of the constituents at the Pleasant Boulevard entrance to the subway. He lives there in the apartment building and was looking down on the Arthur Meehan building at 25 and 55 St. Clair, watching the geothermal be built, the solar panels on top. That he said, your government is really walking the talk of climate change, because we are actually doing what we can do. We are internationally, of course, moving to work together and internationally to phase out the burning coal, and of course have now our co-founded, along with the United Kingdom, the Powering Past Coal Alliance, the coalition of the national and subnational governments, businesses and organizations working to stop bringing coal to produce electricity and make that shift. I think that we are really regulating and providing the incentives for reduced emissions for electricity generation plants, homes, vehicles, buildings, and are committed to cap and cut emissions from the fossil fuel sector and phase out coal export. I think that our target, we have been able to advance our target and improve it to 40-45 because of the work and the projections that have had, and we will continue to keep going as we know we have to, as this big cold country with big distances to travel, have to reduce our reliance on fossil fuel and eliminate it by 2050.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And so now we come to, again, in this question, the segment where there's possibility to query or comment on another participant's observations. And let's begin with Sidney. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
I'm interested in talking about, in Phil, maybe elaborating a little bit more on this notion of a globalized green party or green movement, as it were. I mean, one of the places where I want to be careful, and I want to ask him, I've heard Phil speak in the past a lot about the idea that green technology and green investment in technology will create a more prosperous and sort of wealth building, not only in Canada, but across, if he's speaking about a global movement. My concern is that part and parcel of the green technologies that you're speaking of, when you articulate it in terms of economic growth or prosperity, and as much as I want everyone to be prosperous, my concern with the Green Party is that they really still are sort of banking on this neoliberal agenda of green technology to consume more and to create and generate wealth. And I will tell you one thing, we just launched through science 2 billionaires into space while the rest of us were sitting here choking on wildfire smoke. So I guess I want to talk about the intersection between innovation, technology, wealth production, and who benefits from the wealth production of green technologies in your world.
Thanks, Sidney. And Phil, you have a chance to respond now.
Yeah, thank you. So who benefits from the generation of wealth technology is humanity. Because if we're able to reduce our emissions and get to net zero faster, or ideally, if we can even get there by 2050, then we all benefit. And the question that you ask about the neoliberal agenda of consumption, the Green Party isn't an uber capitalistic party that is arguing for consumption at all consumption's cost. Far from it. In fact, I should mention that much of we forget in the 3 R's is the reduce and the reuse. And in fact, the recycle most of the time isn't even true. Only about 10% of the materials that we put into the recycling is actually really recycled. So, I don't know how to respond beyond saying, would you rather we don't invest in clean technologies? Would you rather we don't have an innovative economy? Would you rather that we let other countries do that and then export their technologies elsewhere and further diminish Canada's international stature on the world stage because we're being too neoliberal? Which again, I think you need to explain a little bit more what you mean by that.
Do I get to?
I'm not clear.
Bill?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Just a definition on what you mean by neoliberal would be.
I think what this stems from me watching a lot of Phil's. I've read a lot of Phil's work. I've read his research. I've listened to his videos. They're accessible in public. Anybody can watch and listen to them on YouTube or wherever else they appear. And I consistently hear the word wealth, and I consistently hear the word prosperity. And I think I just want to ask him once again, I think we're all moving towards, we all want to create a world that creates wellness, inclusion, and prosperity for everyone. But my question again, for you lies in, the pursuit of science doesn't necessarily lift everybody up in an inclusive way. The pursuit of science often can be exclusionary and if not prejudicial against certain populations. And as you said, we're asking third world countries to sort of get with a program that was ours and a legacy that we left them. And I wonder who might be being left out of your programming as you move forward.
Well, first, I'll say yes. Wealth,
very briefly, okay?
Okay.
Falling behind.
Sorry, wealth and prosperity are, of course, things that we should be striving to do. And then secondly, the pursuit of science gave us vaccines to COVID-19. The pursuit of science gave us the internet and the ability to communicate with each other instantly, which we're doing right now. The pursuit of science is how we progress as a species. And the pursuit of science is how we're going to be able to reduce our emissions. So I'm sorry, but as a scientist, I can't help but feel attacked. And I'm surprised that there would be such an anti-science stance from the NDP. So I'll leave it there.
I'm actually not anti-science. All I'm saying is that what I don't hear in the science portion of it is the social science part. That we are actually investing at the same time in a caring economy, that at the same time that as we are, recovering from COVID and the pandemic, that we, I hear you about science, and science is supposed to be this panacea for all things. But I'm going to tell you right now that the enormity of the disparity of poverty and wealth in Canada just keeps growing. And I don't see science resolving that problem right now for us. I don't see science being able to apply a Band-Aid to this increasing disparity in wealth outcomes and prosperity outcomes for Canadians and globally. I don't see that. I mean, I'm not anti-science by any stretch, don't get me wrong. I think that science and innovation is going to help us along. We need these technologies. We need your technology. Your carbon sort of synthesizing technology is crucial as an innovating factor in getting us along in this climate emergency. But my problem is that often when I hear both the Liberals and the Greens talk about the end result for our initiatives together and as a society, that the focus is often on wealth creation. And in the past, what I'm noticing the Liberals, that the wealth creation has created an enormous disparities in our
Well, thank you, Sidney. And Phil, I'm afraid I can't allow any further discussion because I think we're falling behind in our program. Carolyn Bennett may want also to have a word on this debate.
No, I'll wait till the question on agriculture because I'm really keen to hear, because the Green Party in Germany has been very good. I remember once hearing a minister who was the Minister of the Environment and of Agriculture. So I'm waiting for Phil to fill us in on that.
Okay, thank you. Well, congratulations to all panelists. You know, I found it personally to be an illuminating and very civil exchange. But we have to stop this part of the program now and move on to the second part of the program, which is a 5-minute talk by Dr. Teela Johnson on the ways in which climate change affects the health of Canadians. Dr. Teela Johnson works at Unity Health in Toronto, and she holds a faculty appointment at the University of Toronto in the Department of Family Medicine. She's worked in several emergency rooms, hospital wards, and clinics across Toronto. Dr. Johnson has an interest in the intersections of health and climate, a key issue that she'll address this evening. So Teela, please take the screen.
Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you all for having me tonight. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Fingers crossed it goes smoothly. Yes, technology helping me out right now. So I'd like to speak tonight about our health and the climate crisis. As Richard said, I'm a physician who works at Unity Health, and I'm also faculty at University of Toronto. And so to start off, you know, we had just discussed those record temperatures that we had in the West Coast in BC and how those caused widespread forest fires and decimated the town of Lytton. And, you know, from a health perspective, we're seeing the fallout from that type of air pollution. So forest fires release particles into the air that then get inhaled into our bodies and can lead to physical ailments like increasing asthma attacks, increase in lung diseases like COPD, interstitial lung fibrosis, and other lung diseases. There have even been links to air pollution and autism. Studies there are ongoing, but the risk posed by forest fires in terms of air pollution is pretty dire. As well, of course, forest fires do cause injuries and deaths, just in general. Further, climate change is causing different areas to become warmer, some areas to become cooler. In the areas where we're getting warming, that's been inviting migration of tropical insects. And with tropical insects comes new endemic illnesses that can affect health, such as Lyme disease, which is caused by the Ixodes tick migrating north, as well as malaria, which is caused by Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. And those can migrate north. And we might start seeing, we've already started seeing more and more Lyme disease, but we might start seeing more tropical diseases here in Canada. And we've been relatively insulated from those given our cool temperatures classically. In addition, climate change has been causing floods. We've been seeing that in the news. New York just had quite a flood. Europe has been affected by floods. And indeed, even here, Ottawa has recently been having floods. Floods are affecting us all. And floods create injuries and deaths. Obviously, that's a very important issue, but perhaps a lesser known health outcome from floods is overflow of sewage and overflow of animal agriculture going into our waterways. It actually causes something called an algal bloom, which is toxic to the creatures in the water and can also be toxic to dogs, children, and even humans. And so it decreases our access to clean water when these events happen. And then finally, of course, there are high temperatures. You know, we just heard the stat, 500 plus people died in BC due to heat. So heat stroke can cause death, and heat stroke as well, you know, causes disability. So one thing I think that's been missing from our discussions is methane as a driver of climate change. You know, we're all familiar with carbon dioxide. We've been learning about carbon dioxide since I was a child, you know, so just a few years. But what's really important is that methane is 25 times stronger to warm the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. It warms the atmosphere faster than carbon dioxide does. And it actually warms the atmosphere in the order of years versus decades. So it's very potent. It is also the second most abundant greenhouse gas. Here, I've just got a screenshot from the International Panel of Climate Change's most recent report, which highlights the critical importance of reducing our methane emissions. And they actually allude to deep reductions in agricultural emissions as being a key driver of how to do this. We need to act on this situation now. As you've been hearing, this is an urgent situation. You know, we need to prevent global warming 1.5 degrees, you know, and we're already at 1.1 degrees. So we have a very slim margin of error to work with. It is clear that humans are the driver of this climate crisis. And we've had lots of discussion about fossil fuels, but change in energy consumption has been slow. As some of our panelists have identified, energy consumption has been going up and not down, which is the wrong direction. Now, I think that there has been a lack of emphasis on the importance and speed of methane reduction to stop climate change. As well, there's been a lack of emphasis on the role of changing what we eat to stop climate change. A plant-based diet could be very instrumental. How can a plant-based diet help us stop climate change? Well, number one is the rapid reduction in methane. So you can see here from this schematic, this is data from the US. In the US Environmental Protection Agency, as of 2019, notes that enteric fermentation from animal agriculture, as well as manure management from animal agriculture, combined actually release more methane than the oil and gas industry. So as I alluded to earlier, methane can cause rapid warming, but reducing methane can cause rapid cooling. It can actually cause much faster cooling than a similar reduction in carbon dioxide. In addition, decreased demand for meat and dairy products means a reduction in deforestation. And we've been hearing about in the news all of the forests, the old growth forest, the Amazon that's being clear cut, and primarily it's being clear cut to raise meat or raise the foods that we feed to meat. So we're losing a lot of our carbon sinks through that. And then we're also getting more methane when we have more animals on that land. As well, as I alluded to earlier, waste from factory farms can contaminate water supply through floods. It can create algal blooms, and those algal blooms can cause dead zones. And those dead zones, guess what? Release greenhouse gases. So this is just a small snapshot because I only have a short amount of time. But there are many climate benefits to going plant-based, and every reduction, no matter how small, but of course, greater is better, in meat and dairy consumption can help. Plant-based eating and health. Not only are there planetary benefits for plant-based eating, as a physician, every day I see the effects of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and strokes. These are all our _1 killers. In fact, the World Health Organization has classified processed meat as a class 1 carcinogen and other meats in the class 2 carcinogen grouping. So we know, and there have been so many studies that have been done that show the links between eating lots of animal products and all of these illnesses. Besides the direct health benefits of reducing those illnesses, we also get downstream benefits from embracing a plant-based diet, which include reduced need for medical care, reduced need for medications, tons of savings in healthcare resources. If we can pull out all those chronic diseases out of our system, suddenly, we've got more money to spend on other things. Suddenly we can promote, other population goals. Finally, and perhaps something that not many of us have thought about, less exposure to eating meat insulates us against zoonotic diseases such as the swine flu, the avian flu, Ebola, and even COVID-19. All of those illnesses share that they came from either raising animals for our consumption or going out and finding wild animals to consume. Food is medicine, both for us and our planet. As stewards of our health and this planet, moving to a plant-based diet is a concrete action that importantly we can take right away, regardless of political party, regardless of the climate policy. This is us taking a grassroots approach to this environmentalism. We today can all increase the plants in our diet and help ourselves meet our climate targets before we reach that critical tipping point. And at the same time as we're doing that, we also can improve overall human health and wellness. Once again, my name is Dr. Teela Johnson. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. My name is Brianne White. I will be doing starting off the next portion of our evening, which is questions from the audience. So we had some questions submitted prior. We have 3 questions for you tonight. So this is not going to be a debate format. Instead, each candidate will get 90 seconds to respond to each question. And we're going to start with Carolyn tonight. So our first question is about food systems. So how will your government reduce emissions from the agricultural sector? How will your policies encourage farmers to adopt climate-friendly practices? And finally, how will you address the need for a stronger local food infrastructure to protect food security and affordability in Canada? And again, Carolyn, we'll start with you.
I would start by unmuting. Well, I think I've already said how interested I am in this question, and to hear from Phil about the things that have been tried around the world, because this is so important. And I think Dr. Teela just really did explain how this is important. We are helping the farmers adopt the clean technologies, more efficient grain dryers, and using clean energy instead of diesel fuel, doing much more research on environmental problems in agriculture, because for some types of emissions, such as producing cattle, we are having no easy solution there. But I think Teela's given us an idea that she wants us to eat less meat. But I also think that we are working to reduce the GHG emissions from fertilizer, creating a no waste food fund to help players along the food supply chain to adopt ways to reduce food waste, and supporting community-based food security organizations to make sure all Canadians have access to healthy food. And I think that that Nick Saul and all of the work that he began at the stop has been very, very important in how we can move on urban agriculture and be able to have people shop and grow and be able to eat wisely.
Thank you, Carolyn. And we'll move on to Phil, please.
Great, thank you. And before I answer the question, I just want to thank Dr. Teela Johnson for such a wonderful talk. 3 years ago, I became vegetarian precisely to lower my own carbon footprint, and I haven't looked back since. I've actually lost weight and gotten healthier, so it's been fantastic. Specifically with food systems, the biggest driver for emissions in agriculture are monoculture farms and large industrial farms, because what they're doing is typically you end up losing your root systems where the soil can actually capture and sequester CO2. So one of the first things that we should do is promote regenerative agriculture practices in all of our agriculture and farming across Canada. And that's really on the production side of things. Another thing we can do is tackle consumption. Of course, individually, we can all become vegetarian, which would be really important, but also we could try to shorten supply chains and create local food hubs, which will not only help for more locally sourced and lower emissions, because we don't have to worry about transportation emissions from place to place, but it will also help the Canadian economy. The majority of the food that we produce in Canada gets shipped off as exports overseas. We don't yet have as much refining or production and value-added production of raw food materials into things that we eat. So the Greens would want to increase Canada's dependency on domestic production, so replace 1/3 of Canada's food imports with domestic production, which would bring $15 billion back into our economy. And we can do this by investing in value-added food production and local community food hubs across the country.
Thank you so much, Phil. And we'll move on to Sidney finally.
Yeah, this is one of the questions where I think we're all quite on board with one another. Absolutely. I think top of mind for me was moving to a plant-based diet as well. At the local level, and I think Minister Bennett and I share this experience of going to Witchwood Barns. On the local level, providing more support for CSAs, cooperatives, local food hubs, as my colleague from the Green Party has said, and community gardens here in Toronto, St. Paul's. We have a number of them. We've got Cedar Vale, we've got Wellhope, we've got Oriole Park, and Nobleton Community Orchard. And I think at the national level, I think as Phil has discussed, maybe reimagining what conventional farming looks like in Canada, so that we can increase our crop yields. I think also providing better working conditions and fair wages in the agricultural sector and supply chain systems. If we also include and support a clear pathway to citizenship for temporary agricultural workers who have been here sharing their knowledge about their land and their expertise about growing and taking their participation in the Canadian economy a little more seriously and more fairly. I think we want to do, as we've all said, connect farmers more increasingly to local food hubs, develop a food waste strategy that reduces the huge, enormous amounts of food waste that Canadians generate every year. I think that's one of, perhaps as a very rich country, one of our national shames, quite frankly. And supporting a new Democrat government that will also partner with farmers and communities to support biodiversity and exploring new crops and to also help monitor and protect pollinator health. So I think we're all kind of online, and that is very encouraging to me, because at the end of the day, we all are trying to make Canada a better place for all Canadians. And I think in these ways, we are all sort of centered on the same things.
Thank you, Sidney. I'm going to pass to my colleague Lynn for the next question.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying this evening. We're exploring a lot of topics. So the next question is, how will you work to inform the public about the climate crisis and engage them on climate action? Would you consider establishing a role similar to that played in the pandemic by the Chief Medical Officer, Theresa Tam, perhaps a chief climate scientist who is able to explain to the public what needs to be done to deal with the climate emergency and back up what the government is going to have to do, because we're going to notice that there are changes needed. So would that be helpful, or some other way of educating the public? And so I'll start with you, Phil.
I love this question. I'd love to be the chief climate scientist. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful role. And, one of the reasons why I think it's so important is if we look at what the chief medical officer did during the pandemic is, as in a nonpartisan way, speak to the people straight about what is at stake and what we need to do. I actually don't think there needs to be much more education for the public. I think the public knows, by and large, the climate emergency, the state that we're in, if anything. And I've said this, I've tweeted about this before. If I'm lucky enough to become a member of parliament, my first independent members bill would be to instill mandatory scientific literacy training for all members of parliament. I actually think we maybe need a chief science officer or a chief climate scientist for parliamentarians, not for the general public.
Thank you very much. And I'll go to Carolyn next.
Well, I agree, Lynn. I think that I think Phil would be a great chief climate scientist myself. Thinking he might do it. I think this is exciting. I mean, I think that we have to remember, Lynn, that that the Harper government canceled the chief the science advisor, and that was just appalling. And I'm worried that some of these positions can end up vanishing with a stroke of a pen. But I do think that this is the science literacy, I think, is hugely important, and it is about us doing everything we can to have a trusted person speak, whether that's increasing the mandate of the chief science advisor or whether it's a separate position. I'm open to what people think, but I do think that your grassroots organizations are also doing a great job letting the public know what's at risk and how we go forward together. So I go back to my, in public health, we said we had to make the healthy choices the easy choices. We have to do that with all Canadians to make the green choices the easy choices too.
Thank you, Carolyn. And Sidney?
Yeah, I think having a chief climate scientist is actually really important. It's a way to centralize an authoritative source of information that people can trust. But I also would argue that accessing and disseminating that information needs to look a little bit different than just a talking head at a podium. And what I mean by that is when I was working with Doctors Without Borders, I noticed firsthand the power of community outreach campaigns in educating people, certainly with MSF's various healthcare initiatives around sexual reproductive health, vaccination. Civic engagement needs to be done with members of the community, meeting them where they are in terms of their understanding, and inviting members of the community to be real partners in that community engagement. So many people are just so busy; they're just trying to get by, and I think people aren't paying attention, and they need the information to come to them in ways and modes and formats that make sense to them, that are culturally relevant to them, that are easy to digest. And as I said, that delivery by members of their own communities and communities that represent them. And I would argue we need to also invite Indigenous knowledge keepers and agricultural workers who are so very skilled and knowledgeable about the land to share with children and do some education in schools to help children and young people better understand their connection to the land and their place in their relationship to lakes and rivers and oceans and forests and all of the animal life that lives there. And so, yes, I think we need an authoritative central place of real authority and information. And yet I think that dissemination needs to have also sort of a bit of a grassroots component to it.
Thank you very much. That's great. I'm going to pass things back over to Brianne now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. We are going to wrap up here. It is 8:30. So just an enormous thank you to our candidates for participating in tonight's debate about climate and the environment. I think we all learned a lot tonight. We covered a broad range of topics, and it was just really wonderful to hear from each of you on these critical issues. So thank you for everyone for attending tonight. Special thank you to our moderator, Richard Sandbrook, and to Dr. Teela Johnson for her segment on health today. Richard, you did a wonderful job moderating. We really appreciate you. Thank you. Thanks to GreenPAC for hosting this debate, our organizing team, Lynn, Daniel, myself, Melissa, our tech help for tonight, and of course, our sponsor, the Van City Community Investment Bank. So with that, I will say thank you very much. Good night, and make sure you go out and vote.